Welcome to my video on Associated Press style rule for times. Alright, this one is pretty simple. There's really just a couple of rules that you need to remember, but let's get right to it. The stylebook entries that we'll be dealing with are the entry for times and the entry for time sequences. There are a couple of related entries there that we'll take a look at later on. First of all, let's talk about that out of the way. Let's talk about the basic rule on writing time of day. So you always use figures. 7 a.m., 8:35 p.m. Any reference to time of day uses figures, and that's pretty intuitive. The second thing you need to remember is that, as I've done here, if we're talking about a time that's exactly on the hour, then no .00. Okay, so we would never write 7 p.m. for example, or a.m., whatever the case may be. p.m. There we go. So don't do that. All right, let's get rid of that. Make that correct. Then you only need to use a colon if there are minutes after the hour. Right. Also, notice how I've been writing a.m. and p.m. Always use lowercase letters. Use a period. And this is one thing that trips up students sometimes. I see this and I don't know why people are doing this, but there is most definitely a space between the time and the AM and PM. So yeah, type 7 space P period M period. Okay. So those are all pretty basic. There are a few other AP style rules related to times, one of which is to, and this is getting into working the times into a story. Avoid redundancies, and what I mean by this is writing sentences like, the robbery happened at 7 p.m. last night. Now obviously 7 p.m. indicates a time that is at night or in the evening. So saying 7 p.m. last night is redundant. If it's p.m. it was obviously nighttime or evening time. So in that case what we would do is to use something like 7 p.m. yesterday, although we're going to look in a future video that AP discourages the use of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So why don't we be something more specific like 7 p.m. Monday. All right, but the main thing I want you to get for now is don't use p.m. in connection with a word like evening or tonight, or 10 a.m. today, for example. I should correct what I just said. It would be acceptable to say 10 a.m. today. What you want to avoid it would be saying something like 10 a.m. this morning. All right, so we want to get away from words that clearly communicate morning when you've already said that the time is in the morning. Okay, that's the sort of redundancy that you want to avoid with the time of day. Okay. I covered this on another video, but I'll go ahead and mention it again. Don't use words like 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. Always instead say noon or midnight. Okay, AP considers these to be less confusing. Some people are ignorant of whether 12 p.m. is in the morning or in the evening. Personally, I don't find it confusing, but AP says let's keep it straight. Use noon and midnight. Finally, the last little thing I want to go over here is 5 o'clock. Okay, this is acceptable, and you do use numerals to write things like this, but it's preferred that you use a more conventional numerals with AM and PM rather than saying 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I think the only time I would really do that is if it is in quotes. Okay, if somebody's speaking and you want to quote them and you say, I think this fire started around 5 o'clock, then if they said 5 o'clock, you can write it in this form. Otherwise, stick with the AM and PM usage. One last thing that I want to mention. Everything we've talked about so far deals with times on a clock. If you're making a casual use like 5 minutes, the game will start in 5 minutes, or he ran for 2 hours, the general rule on numbers applies here. So it's 0 through 9, write it out as words. 10 and above, use figures. Okay, so if I wanted to say 12 hours, we would do it like that. The only exception to that, the only other thing we could even be talking about is the entry that I mentioned back at the beginning of this video for time sequences, where you have something like he ran for 2 hours, 13 minutes and 10 seconds. The type of thing that you might do in a sports story, maybe in a scientific context. If you have a sequence, you're trying to communicate the length of a time, the duration of something in hours, minutes, and seconds. For the sake of consistency, AP says to use figures all the way through. Also, incidentally, on second reference to this, if you had already used that construction once in a story, you could go and write it this way. This is, again, a common thing in sports stories, like covering track and field, but that does not come up very often. So, in general, if you're just referring to hours, minutes, seconds, the regular rule on numbers applies. So, a 0 through 9, words, 10 and above, numerals. The only exception is where you have a sequence like this, and in that case, use figures. That's really all there is to numbers for times.